Hello, and welcome to Counting Crasher, where we recap The Courtship, Season 1, Episode 10, Carousel of Events. Now, last week we said goodbye to Mr. Hunter, and now we have 5 suitors left, from left to right, Mr. Cones, Mr. Nazir, Mr. Chapman, Mr. Bokikio, and Mr. Judge. This is going to be a very involved recap. If you want to listen to the shorter version, I'll have one up in a few days where I cover my top crashes and top crushes. We start right away with the daily tea. Miss Remy and her court are having breakfast by the lake. The daily tea reads, "The past, present, and future were all equally in gloom. Enter stage left, our pleasure garden. Expect dancing, carousels, fire breathing, and tea leaf reading. Be prepared to look into the leaves for a glimpse into the past and future. All eyes are upon the remaining suitors to see whether a chivalrous Mr. Darcy emerges or indeed a villainous Mr. Wickman, the charming Tad who would seduce the ladies but was unable to commit. What does the future hold?" And in this episode, we actually get hints about who Nicole's Mr. Darcy is and who her Mr. Wickman is. So Miss Remy tells her family about what happened with Mr. Chapman last week, that days after he told her he was falling in love with her, that he wasn't sure he could give up his nomadic lifestyle. The suitors are back at their quarters discussing how Miss Remy found out about Mr. Chapman's hesitations about commitment. Mr. Nazir admits to the group that he was the one that told her, but he says it wasn't done in a malicious way. Mr. Chapman says that's, quote, bullshit, and that Mr. Nazir violated the bro code. The guys press Mr. Chapman to know if this is love or lust for him, and Mr. Chapman thinks it's lust that can maybe become love. He goes on to say he thinks Nicole is in love with her. We see a lot of eye rolls from the guys at this point, and I don't blame them. Meanwhile, back at the castle, Nicole tells her family that she feels the tough conversation she had with Mr. Chapman last week has created a stronger emotional bond between them. Yes, this is cringy, and we aren't shown how her court reacts to this news, which I wish we did. The family continues to talk and agrees to have individual conversations with the suitors to really grill them. Miss Remy says she wants her father to talk to Mr. Bokikio, who she says is intimidated by Mr. Remy. She wants her sister to talk to Mr. Nazir, her brother Dom to talk to Mr. Judge, and her mother will speak with Mr. Cones, and she was very excited to do so because that's the one she wanted to speak to. But however, what we aren't shown in this episode, but Nicole had posted on her Instagram, is that Tessa was asked to speak with Mr. Chapman, and we'll have more on that later. So Mrs. Remy says a good question to ask the suitors is, and I quote, "to find how people deal with the acceptance of being Black. And I'm not as concerned about what it means to them because clearly it doesn't matter, but what it means to their family and their community." Miss Remy says in her ITM, "It's not a question I should have to ask, but it's my reality. I'm a Black woman, and these are things that I have to consider in any relationship that I'm in." Nicole's brother Dom discusses to his family how he needs to go back soon for his baby that's on the way, and he jokes that he can't wait to find out who the future uncle will be. Mrs. Remy starts guessing names, and I personally think she went in the order that Nicole is favoring her suitors right now. She says Uncle Danny, Uncle Lincoln, Uncle Christian, Uncle Jesse, or Uncle Miles. Her brother gets very sweet at this moment, and he talks about how he loves seeing his sister become a grown woman. He's older than her, so he never really got to see that in their childhood. The entire family goes into a love fest. They start hugging each other and telling each other how much they love each other and tearing up. It's really a sweet moment. I love this family, and I love that we get to see how amazing they are. So this is the side note I was mentioning earlier. We were not shown Tessa's conversation with Mr. Chapman in this episode, but we could see here the Instagram post Nicole had posted. And we were also not shown last week when her sister Danielle had a conversation with Mr. Chapman. So I wish we did get to see them, because I have a feeling her family are seeing the red flags and are confronting him on this. Now it's evening and everyone is coming in to attend the Pleasure Garden, which is a beautiful themed park carnival. They're all shown enjoying the carousel, and eventually they begin the one-on-one tea leaf readings between Nicole and each of her suitors. First up is Mr. Judge. They both say they are nervous. The psychic reads the tea leaves and she says, quote, Jesse is a really good catch, big heart, very honest, but I'm seeing wedding bells, Jesse, so I think you are ready for marriage. Nicole says in her ITM that she could see herself marrying Jesse. She thinks he's a good guy and would be a great husband. Jesse kisses Nicole and says, we can't stop there. That was spot on. And in his ITM, he says he wants marriage. He clearly is super into Nicole and has the right intentions here. I just love Jesse. Definitely a front runner. We're just not seeing their relationship on screen, which is too bad. Next, we see Mr. Rémy having his one-on-one chat with Mr. Boquicchio. We know that Mr. Boquicchio is intimidated by Nicole's parents and hasn't really impressed them yet. They're both concerned and they want to know if he's ready for commitment. Mr. Rémy asks Mr. Boquicchio if he could see himself marrying Nicole, and he says he could. Mr. Rémy asks what made you evolve, and Mr. Boquicchio says they've come a long way since they last spoke, that he and Nicole challenge each other in a positive way. Mr. Rémy says, good answer, and Mr. Rémy then asks how would Mr. Boquicchio's family feel about Nicole? And Mr. Boquicchio says they would accept her no matter what. He talks about his big family and how close he is with his brother, who he considers his best friend. The two of them bond over being best friends with their brothers. It's very sweet. And Mr. Rémy says in his ITM that Mr. Boquicchio has won him over. Yay! Next up is Mrs. Rémy and Mr. Cones. She asks him about wanting kids, and he reacts with the funniest face, but immediately says, of course, of course. She asks about Mr. Cones' family accepting Nicole because she comes from a black family, and Mr. Cones assures her that they would. He goes on to talk about his stepmom, who is Afro-Brazilian, and assures her their family and Nicole would be accepted. Mrs. Rémy feels assured by Mr. Cones, and in her ITM, she calls him a big teddy bear. I definitely agree. And she says he's fun, funny, kind, and thinks Nicole would have a greater chance at happiness with him than the other guys. Next up for the tea leaf reading is Mr. Nazir, who at this point is tipsy, and it's hilarious. He's really partying up tonight, and it's adorable. I love it. I'm here for it. The psychic tells him that his cup is empty, and that means he really wants to be in a relationship. She says he has a lot of love in his heart to give, and he's ready to give it. She says she'd like to see the two of them dating and enjoying it. Mr. Nazir in his ITM says he loves this reading and says it's a slam dunk. Unfortunately, though, we don't get to see or hear what Nicole thinks about this. Next is Mr. Boquicchio. He comes up and interrupts Mr. Nazir and Mr. Rémy, telling him that his time has ended. And in Mr. Boquicchio's ITM, he says he doesn't believe in fortune telling, but he's still nervous about it. The psychic tells them there is much more to find out about Danny. He needs to open his heart and forget about the past, to trust and to tell Nicole how he feels. She goes on to tell him, you have to understand that not everyone can read minds. You have to tell them. And then in his ITM, he says, it's crazy that the psychic actually knew that. And I have to say, Mr. Bokikio is adorable during this segment. There is something so charming about him. He just comes across so authentic and real. And unfortunately, we don't get to see Nicole react to any of this or have her talk about her thoughts on the reading. Next, we see the conversation between Dom and Mr. Judge. Dom asks for Mr. Judge's thoughts about joining a Black family and navigating that reality, and if Mr. Judge has even thought about this. Mr. Judge is truthful, saying he never thought about the barrier, and he hopes that he can be informed and expand from his bubble environment and learn about new perspectives. Mr. Dom thinks Mr. Judge has a big heart, and he seems to like what he hears. And yeah, I agree. Mr. Judge is very sweet. There's almost an innocence about him, and he definitely has a big heart. And yeah, I'm a fan. Next, we see Danielle and Mr. Nazir. They're talking, and she asks if Nicole can fit into his family and lifestyle. Mr. Nazir brings up his last serious relationship and the clashing between his family and the person he was dating. He talks about how that now he's happy in life with his career, but what he's missing is love. And he says he feels a connection with Nicole and is ready to have his happy ending. It seems that Miss Baker likes what she hears, and she seems to also really like Mr. Nazir. I like him too, and I'll hold and talk more about that later. So we're back with the tea leaf reader, and this time it's with Nicole and Mr. Chapman. The psychic says she's being shown half a heart, that there's only half of what there is you need, attraction, intellectual level, but there is something missing. She says the half heart means that there is more to build on. So if we were to set you free now, this relationship would build and grow, and that's a positive thing. We then go to Nicole in her ITM, and she says that the half your heart comment is beautiful, that together they will make a full heart. Nicole says this reading gave her validation that she needed, which is interesting because then we switch to Mr. Chapman in his ITM, and he says that he sees this something missing as Nicole being in love with him, and he's not sure if he's there yet. Honestly, I hate this. You can see Nicole is loving this reading and seeing a future with Mr. Chapman. The way she looks at him adoringly during this reading is upsetting. The whole time we see Mr. Chapman pressing his lips and looking like he doesn't want to be there. I can see why they both came away with different thoughts on this reading. The psychic was very vague, and it could be read either way, but I feel like Mr. Chapman is being deceptive because he's holding back truths. He's not being fully transparent. The way he talks in front of the other suitors versus the way he speaks in front of her is completely different. And I think if he spoke more freely and openly with Nicole, she would have sent him home way earlier. So up next for the tea reading is Mr. Counts. He's clearly excited for this and it's really cute. In his ITM, he says he's into tarot card readings and astrology. The psychic says on paper she doesn't think the two of them match, but that doesn't matter because Mr. Combs would really make Nicole laugh, and that's something that some of the others try to do, but they can't tick that box. She goes on to say that laughter is the key to love, and they need to keep that going. Mr. Combs loves hearing this. He turns to Miss Remy, super excited. His face is just everything. And he says, "We have so much to talk about. I'm not even kidding." And it's lovely. We get to see how he feels about this, but again, we're left in the dark with Nicole. We don't get to see her response. And so it seems like we only got to see her response with Mr. Chapman and Mr. Judge and not the other three. And I think there's a reason for that with editing, but we could talk about that more later. Now that the tea leaf readings are over, we see everyone dancing. They're on the dance floor. They're having fun. We zero in on Miss Remy dancing with Mr. Boquicchio. He tells her that he thinks outside of all this, she will always be grilling him. She says she doesn't know how he really feels, and I guess that's why she's grilling him. Mr. Boquicchio says he'll always tell her the truth, something we consistently hear from him, and honestly, I believe him. I think he's been nothing but truthful with her and really real and kind of taking this whole thing more seriously than most of them and mature enough to get it, I guess. Then Mr. Nazir tries to cut in, and Mr. Boquicchio tells him to F off. It's hilarious. Nicole bursts into laughter. It's really funny. I am loving Mr. Boquicchio's New Yorker vibe. I love that he's real, he's honest. There's no facade. He's clearly there for Nicole. Next, we see Miss Remy and Mr. Chapman on the carousel. She tells him that she's glad he's still there. She talks about his worry about giving her the life that she wants, but she says what she's come to realize is what she really wants is someone who looks at her the way he does, making her heart skip a beat. Mr. Chapman says he's terrified of regret and not having closure. He tells her as long as she has patience to let him figure himself out, he'd like to stick it out and figure it out with her. Miss Remy says she'll be patient with him, that she has patience for those she really cares about. She feels like they've moved on from last week, which clearly they haven't, at least he hasn't, and that they have a once-in-a-lifetime connection. Oh, so tough to hear. Then we see Mr. Cones in an ITM discussing his distaste for Mr. Chapman's deception and that Nicole really needs to spend more time with him. Listen, I'm loving the side of Mr. Cones. Since he opened up to her, you can see his walls have come down and he's ready to pursue her hard and romantically, and I'm here for it. Yes, loving Mr. Cones. The next day, we see the date between Miss Remy and Mr. Judge. They take a carriage ride trip into the countryside to pick apples and have a picnic. They talk about falling in love. Miss Remy says she was once in love, but then the guy moved for a job and he didn't ask her to come with him or do the long distance. She says she knows it was love and she has no regrets. Mr. Judge says he knew he was in love with his ex when she brought him dinner while he was working. That made him fall in love with her, and he sees that quality with Miss Remy with her big heart and supportive nature. Miss Remy feels Mr. Judge is a safe bet, and in her ITM, she says she worries that there's no edge to him. She clearly is attracted to him, though, and they kiss passionately. Next is Miss Remy and Mr. Nazir. She sits down with him for a quick chat after her date with Mr. Judge. She wants to know about his thoughts on commitment. He talks about Miss Remy coming to London to visit him and to see his world. Miss Remy is concerned about his work and his need to be in London and the fact that he can't work remotely. She's concerned about how they could work even as boyfriend and girlfriend. He says he hasn't called someone a girlfriend in 4 years. He knows he wants it, but he doesn't know when that will happen for him. Miss Remy says in her ITM she sees a relationship with Mr. Nazir that would be exciting but risky. Meanwhile, back at the gentleman quarters, the men discuss a life with Nicole in the real world. Mr. Cones and Mr. Boquicchio both talk about having an amazing life with Nicole in the real world, but Mr. Chapman says His ideal relationship would be casual, where they don't live together, but only see each other periodically and not communicate every day. He wants a lot of space in a relationship to keep the spark alive. Mr. Bokikio disagrees, would want daily contact with someone he was in a relationship with, otherwise he would leave. Mr. Cohn says if he was a traveling soul like Mr. Chapman, he'd want his partner to be traveling with him shotgun. And Mr. Combs in his ITM says he's concerned, and he thinks if Miss Remy knew how Mr. Chapman really felt, she would have sent him home long ago. Mr. Combs says time is ticking, and both her heart and the other suitors are on the line. The next day is the farewell dance. Miss Remy says she's feeling excited but confused. Two men are on the dance card, Mr. Nazir and Mr. Judge. That means Mr. Combs, Mr. Chapman, and Mr. Bokikio are all safe. There's a cute moment when they're going up to the balcony because they are safe, where Bokikio stops halfway up the stairs and looks back at Nicole, and she gives them this adorable smile back. It's a very sweet moment. So Mr. Judge is the first one to dance. Miss Remy tells him life with him would be safe and comfortable, but she also wants it to be fun and adventurous. He assures her he wants this too, and he wants to show her that side of him. Nicole says in this case she thinks that the safe bet is the great bet and asks him to stay. She says she wants him to let his hair down and be spontaneous around her. He gives her a big hug and says he's going to try. Up next is Mr. Nazir. She tells him that he's chivalrous and exciting, but he's lacking stability. She's worried about his level of commitment. He tells her it's up to her to see if she could fit in his odd and complicated life. He thinks she's wonderful and beautiful, and he's prepared to make it work. She tells him that she doesn't think their lifestyles would work together. He calls her a little minx that deserves the world. He gives her a big hug. They say farewell, but not goodbye forever. Clearly, these two are going to stay friends. There's no hard feelings. He looks up and tells the boys to take care of her, and actually it's a wonderful send-off. Probably my favorite send-off because it wasn't sad. It was more like, okay, yeah, we're not going to work, and it's good. We're all good. And then the episode ends horribly because later that night, Mr. Chapman sneaks into Miss Remy's bedroom in the castle. She, of course, is happy to see him. He tells her he wants more time with her, time to figure stuff out. Miss Remy in her ITM says that they are complete opposites, but they can't fight their once-in-a-lifetime connection. The episode ends with them kissing in bed. Yikes. So that's it. That's the end of the episode. We're down to 4 men, Mr. Combs, Mr. Chapman, Mr. Bokikio, and Mr. Judge. I, as promised, will give a shorter recap with my top crashes and my top crushes. Give me a few days to get that to you. And thank you for listening. Please, please, please give this video a thumbs up. Please subscribe so I can do more of this content for you. Loving this show. I hope you're enjoying this. Thank you.